and welcome to Artcast, uncovering the creative industry with me, Olivia Savage, as your host. Here we talk about all things art, and each week I'll be joined by inspiring Max creatives to discuss creative careers, as well as burning topics in the art world today, to keep that creative mind of yours in action. Welcome back to another episode of Island Artcast. Here we are at home in lockdown. What a mix-up we're in again. I hope everyone's staying safe and washing your hands. I'm currently sat here waiting for a COVID test result. I know other people that have got it. It seems to be everywhere. But just because we're back in lockdown doesn't mean that the podcast has to stop. So let's get stuck in. For those of you who don't know, March is the host month for International Women's Day. So it seemed only fitting that we have an episode in honor of this and focus on gender in the creative industry. The creative industry has come a long way with regard to gender equality in terms of salary and opportunities, but there is still a notable imbalance between men and women in the workplace. On today's show, I'm joined by student, artist, and musician Alice Dudley, and Professor and Illustrator Joe Davies. Together, we're going to approach this much talked about topic. We will unpick the historical attitude towards women in the creative industry and how far we have developed, as well as what there is still yet to accomplish, particularly when you look at the difference in numbers between male and female students undertaking creative related degrees compared to the number of male versus female professionals working in the industry. So, hi, welcome to you both. How are you both doing in lockdown? Alice, how have you been getting on since we went into this a week ago?
I've been okay. I mean, I think I was quite lucky, to be honest, because unlike a lot of the people on my course who are all scattered around the UK, I actually got to put on an exhibition the other week, and I think the exhibition ended the day before things started all going a little bit wrong. So I kind of managed to time things perfectly. I've struggled a little bit because I was in the middle of making a record, and that's obviously come to a halt now.
Mm-hmm. So can you not do any recording now at home?
Well, thankfully, I think, again, I was quite lucky. I think we managed to get most of the stems that I needed to do myself. So we're hoping we can carry on working remotely. So I definitely am kind of feeling quite optimistic. It could have been much worse for me.
Yeah, that's good. Joe, how have you been doing?
Well, for me, life is very much like being in lockdown usually anyway, because I work mostly from home. Mm-hmm. It just means that because we're shielding me and my husband, we've got personal shoppers, which is a gain for us, really. So I can't really complain about it. Because I've worked freelance for a lot of my life, I'm quite disciplined at getting out of bed and kind of working at my table and organising my time to be here. So there's not very much transition. But like you, Alice, we've got an exhibition for the book that I illustrated, which opened at the Manx Museum a couple of weeks ago. So that's obviously stalled now because there's nobody able to go and visit it. But I think it is just like that, really. It's a little interruption for us, isn't it, on the island? I think because the government handle it so well here, we can feel quite confident, I think, that maybe in a few weeks' time we'll be in a different place. So fingers crossed, I feel quite optimistic.
Yeah, I definitely still have that temporary feeling and feel that hope that it is a circuit breaker and not a full-blown indefinite lockdown.
Yeah.
But if you're already working freelance, then do you have like a setup ready, like an office setup for yourself at home?
Well, actually, I live in quite a big house and we've got a lot of rooms, but somehow I'm the one who's on the dining room table. So we've got a studio upstairs and we've got a book room upstairs and another room upstairs. But actually, I'm down here with the dogs, and that means that I get all the barking when I'm in like business meetings, when the postman arrives, and I have to kind of put my things away at the end of the day. But I quite like that. I quite like working on my knee on the settee sometimes as well. You know, I don't feel like I need an office with my name on the door or anything. It's quite nice being at home and feeling like I'm at home. So yeah, I just kind of, move around, and laptops are brilliant, aren't they? You can do it in the garden when the sun comes out.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, I'm sort of in like my utility in my house, even though we have a lot of rooms as well. But It's weird how you end up in these places, but I really like it. I feel like it's become my space amongst the coast.
Next to the washing
Great.
machine.
Yeah, exactly. This is the boiler just behind me, so I'm staying warm. Okay, so let's get stuck into the episode. I'm gonna start with some statistics that I found that I thought would be really interesting to contribute to the episode today. So according to the Destinations of Leavers from Higher Education, the DLHE, looking at education in the UK in 2016 to 2017, there were 7,162 males that graduated in creative arts subjects, of which 40.6% went on to work in a creative profession 6 months after graduation. Now, compare this to the female population, there were 12,865 female students undertaking a creative arts related degree, so that's nearly double. But only 30.3% went on to work in the creative industry 6 months after graduation. So despite the fact that there were nearly double the amount of women studying a creative degree, the proportion of women in the creative industry following graduation was 10% less than that of men. Now, granted, you can argue what defines a creative subject, and equally whether education, so a traditionally academic environment, is at all actually the right place for creativity. This is something that I'm going to touch on in another episode because I feel like it has a whole discussion in itself. But nevertheless, I mean, I took fine art at uni myself, and there were about 65 to 70 students in my year. I don't know the exact figures, but I could tell you that I could count on my hands how many of them were male. And so when we would go into things like lectures and seminars, and particularly smaller group projects, there was really never more than 2 guys in my group or class at the time. So however you want to look at it, I believe that there's some truth in those statistics. And so I guess my question is, why is it the case? And that's what we're going to be exploring in this episode today. So let's begin. Alice, you are new to the creative industry. You were telling me that you haven't actually worked in the creative field yet, as in you haven't been paid to work in the creative field yet, I mean. Is that right? Yeah. But I mean, you've been working as a student, so you've still been very much involved in the arts world. And your artwork actually depicts the history of feminism in the form of contemporary art. I'm a huge fan of your work, as I told you the other day. I think your prints are so delicate in a way, which I think really lends itself to the female subject. So what is it about feminism that really inspired you to base your practice around it? What was that you clinged on to when you were reading about it?
Well, thank you, first of all. That's very nice. I think for me, it's striking, I guess, immediately that obviously the art world has historically been dominated by men and by the male gaze. Mm-hmm. And so I think any work made by women that's sort of transgressive, particularly anything that's sort of body-centric, it still feels just as relevant today as it did when sort of second wave artists like Judy Chicago, Hannah Wilke were making their work in the 70s. There are different issues today, obviously, but it still feels just as relevant. It still feels just as powerful as sort of a reclaiming. So I think I've been inspired by a lot of contemporary artists, but I've also recently, with the work that you were talking about, I was doing a lot of research when I was writing my dissertation at the start of the year. I was doing a lot of research around sort of Renaissance artists and artists from the early modern era, but also the historical context outside of the artwork, and just the way in which the role of the female form has changed in art over time, and sort of the lasting stigma around female sexuality. And it started to drive a lot of my work now, because I think there's definitely still conversation to be had. But yeah, I think it's just a lot of my work. It's not all necessarily feminist work. I wouldn't necessarily box myself in strictly as a feminist artist, but I'm an artist and I'm a feminist. So it is going to go hand in hand. And I think sometimes you might want to have an outward conversation with your audience about sort of social issues. Other times sometimes it just might feel like a conversation you need to have with yourself as well. Sometimes there might be your own issues, your own experiences that you want to work through. Sort of, I don't know, body image, self-worth, mental health, maybe sort of recovering from an unhealthy relationship or something that's quite personal, but still ends up resulting in creating work, which is definitely viewed by others through this sort of feminist lens. I just think it's important, and it definitely inspires me a lot more than any of my other work. I'm definitely inspired by a lot of other women as well, more than anything else in my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know what you mean, especially about when you look at how women have been depicted through the history of art. When I wrote my dissertation, I was doing it on 20th century art, so the avant-garde, and there was a quote that I remember from a surrealist artist that was in 1929 by Andre Breton, and he said, I might get the exact wording wrong here, but he said something like, the problem of woman is the most marvelous and disturbing problem in the world. And it was so weird to read how men through art saw women as like this enigma, like because we possessed these emotions that they couldn't comprehend. And I think, I am a feminist, but my work isn't about feminism or sexism directly. But I think it kind of comes up subconsciously. I mean, do you find that even when you're not making a conscious effort to maybe mark a specific point in history or make a specific point through your artwork, that you find it just comes through inspiration naturally for you as a woman?
It does, yeah, it definitely does. And a lot of the time, the work that I'm most passionate about normally is sparked by something very unexpected. It will normally be sort of, I might read something that shocks me or that unsettles me or something. And I think it was a lot of the work I've been making recently, it was definitely the case. I wrote my dissertation about the role of the witch in visual art and about how female sexuality was originally celebrated in ancient goddess worshipping cultures, but then by the onset of Christianity and it gradually sort of women's images distorted over time until they were actually being persecuted as witches for the very things that they were being celebrated for not that long ago. And I think after reading that completely by accident, I ended up writing my dissertation on it. I felt very passionately about it. I ended up making a whole body of work. But I think for me, you can read about that and you can be fascinated and appalled, but it can sometimes feel quite distant, obviously. Like, well, it's not happening now. But then sometimes you can stumble upon other things and it can really hit you. I think I read recently that the very first detailed research study about female pleasure and specifically the clitoris was only published in 1998, which is the year I was born. Mm-hmm. And I think that really struck me because I was making work about the stigma attached to female sexuality at the time. And here I am making work about how female sexuality has historically been dismissed and even persecuted. And then I come across this article that says that, you know, something resembling concrete understanding of female pleasure is only as old as I am, mm-hmm. and that it's still being dismissed in contemporary society. Like, I think just sort of sometimes reading things like that, it can kind of, you can be quite taken aback by it. And I think a lot of those feelings is often what makes you produce your most powerful work.
Definitely. I totally agree. So as you're saying, you almost don't realize how much it still exists in the present day. And coming forward to that. So Jo, you're actually, I mean, compared to Alice and me, who are super new to the industry, you have a lot of experience working in the creative industry, being a freelance illustrator as well as a professor at, you were at the college and you're still at Plymouth University now. So what is your experience as a woman working in this field? I mean, you've mentioned to me that you have found yourself to be in the minority as a woman amongst male colleagues. So have you ever, with that, found yourself having to face challenges or experiences that you think is because of the fact that you are a woman?
Well, I think because my career does go over different areas, really. I'm a professor in university, as you say, and I'm also an illustrator and I'm a writer. I think my experiences are different in each of those contexts. And I think as a professor, when I started working in university, I wasn't really conscious of myself as a woman. I was just a person. And I think it was only when I kind of looked back several years after being in post, really, that I realised actually I was in quite a minority as a female in my role, probably on a national level. But at the time, I didn't realise I had just had a job to get on with, and that's what I was focused on. So I think at certain levels in universities and academic institutions, and I'm sure it's the same in many institutions nationally, women are, often quite prevalently occupying roles at a certain level, and then you find that maybe that kind of thins out as you get higher. I mean, I think that's kind of pretty commonplace that's been acknowledged. I think the creative industries, I think maybe over the last 10 years, since I've kind of been working across the creative industries, there has been a shift. And I think that's possibly because of shifts which have happened just generally around broader areas of discrimination. I mean, the Black Lives Matter is a separate topic, but that's a kind of another indicator of that, where I think people have got a bit more of an altruistic attitude. They're thinking more about other people, they're thinking about equality, they're thinking in a more ethical way about how they practice just across areas of society. And I think the kind of feminism, equality for the gender is part of that sort of action for change, really, the cultural change. So I think even in my own career, I think within the kind of sphere of education, I think there's much more kind of representation of women at higher roles. But I don't think that's always been the case. In my kind of career history, as you say, I'm much older than you are, so I have seen sort of that kind of change happen in front of me. But I mean, I think, referring back to your earlier point about the number of graduates and their destinations, I think it's kind of mixed within the areas of the art. I mean, I would say working in academic kind of circles, you do notice, as you've kind of recognised, that there are more women in particular areas of maybe education, creative education. But I think that you might find that if you look at product design, maybe that might be perceived as a male-dominated area, whereas like textile design, illustration, which is my area, is much more female-dominated. But I think when you get into the industry and kind of span that over time, there's much more diversity within the industry, and that's been kind of championed within the last few years as well by publishers and employers. I mean, I think for me, in the creative industries, although there are kind of tendencies in certain areas for there to be more females kind of dominant, like in publishing, you often find a lot of females in high roles in publishing. But I think that there's much more kind of sensitivity now just about being discriminate and just people making kind of more conscious choices. So I think there is a big sort of shift in the creative industries, because it's where the creatives live, who are thinking outside of boxes and being kind of open-minded and encouraging kind of changes in attitude. So I think, myself, I think I've always been driven by my own ambitions and my own intentions. And I kind of haven't realised I've been a woman, really. So I think in my career, I've just kind of had an idea and wanted to do it and kind of put myself forward. And then sometimes I look around the room and think, oh yeah, I'm the only woman here. And I'm kind of conscious of that. But it's not necessarily been that I've kind of thought I'm going to kind of go into this male bastion domain and kind of try and forge a way into it. I just have kind of ignored myself as a woman and just been a person. And I think that's maybe that my own kind of upbringing, really, that my family, we just kind of, that's how I was brought up to kind of just try and think of myself as an individual, really, and just kind of put myself in situations because of the things I'm good at, rather than kind of, being in a particular role or stereotypal in my behaviours.
Yeah.
So that's a rounding out.
No, I totally agree. I mean, I've been raised the same way in that my parents have always said it's never come up about difficulties of being a woman. And I think that's in the workplace. And I think that's testament, like you were saying, to how far we have come and how we have actually shifted, in that now we are trying to teach children from a young age to just not consider these things when you're moving up in the creative workplace, and eliminate the stigma that way from early on. And I think I would definitely agree. I think more things have been put in place for women, so that we avoid this level of discrimination, particularly when you're moving up higher and higher and you're gaining more authority and stuff. But I do think what I would say is that maybe there is still sort of a casual attitude or a casual sort of level of sexism in the workplace, I would argue. I mean, Alice and me were talking the other day how we have both worked in bars for a long time. We haven't worked in the industry, but I've been in the workplace. And when you work in a place like a bar or a restaurant or something, there's definitely sexism still going around. I've worked in different cities and stuff, and it still exists. And I think this is more what it's become now. And there is more sort of casual stereotyping going on. So words are being associated with women like, oh, she's bossy, or she's bitchy, or she's catty, that you may not realize aren't being applied to men anywhere near as much as they're being applied to women.
I think that we're in a strong position though, aren't we, as visual communicators, because like Alice is talking about her work where she's exploring like notions of like the kind of female, the male gaze towards women, and that's been kind of documented through like Susan Sontag, the writer, has explored that really kind of intensively, hasn't she? And I think in a way, in illustration as an example, we're kind of encouraged really to depict females in strong roles, to break that whole kind of cycle of children thinking that the girls are making the cake in the kitchen while the boys are climbing the trees and doing kind of strong things or discovering the world or whatever. So through illustration, through visual communication, through art, like Alice is talking about, we can explore these issues in ways that are much more accessible. People can see what we mean, and we can change those kind of stereotypes by our depiction and our exploration and expression around these issues. So I think we're in quite a good position. And as an author as well, and working with people who've written books for children as an example, that's where we can again challenge kind of stereotypes and present a much more equal view of the way that the world can be, really. Because I think people just are often, it's not that they're deliberately ignorant, is it? They just haven't had access to the same education that we've all had. And I think people just, they've not been really taught to think or perceive things maybe from a different perspective than the one that they've already kind of known. I think you're right. When people do use words like, oh, she's bossy, and and I think I find that quite difficult myself. When people say, oh, you're quite an aggressive person, you think, oh, I'm actually not, I'm really kind of passive person, but they mean you're assertive, and that's different. I think I take that as a kind of medal of honor, really. So I think you're right, kind of language can be really kind of dangerous, can't it? And it can kind of create a sort of tension and an expectation which is kind of misaligned to people's qualities and strengths, really.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this sort of attitude of language is maybe one of the more longer term changes that we have to make, that we can do by being in a fortunate position where we've come far enough that we have the things in place to not have to experience direct sexism, but still in a position where we are aware that we have to keep making changes. So we're in quite a positive position, I think. But I know for me in particular, I can often find myself, just writing this podcast, I was kind of thinking, okay, I don't want to make this sound like we are just hormonal women that are coming on to scream about men. And I didn't want it to be perceived that way, but I then have to stop myself and think, go into this without that mindset, go into this without worrying about that kind of stereotype. And so Alice, do you ever feel like with your artwork, like you are ever worried that you're coming across with a negative connotations that can be applied to feminism and feminists, or do you sort of go into it embracing that and embracing that sort of opportunity to change that view?
I think it's definitely taken me a little bit of time to sort of be fully comfortable exploring issues like this, because I've definitely noticed my work start to get bolder and a little bit more ambitious over the the time that I've been doing my degree. But I still get these moments like where I feel uncomfortable with the fact that a lot of my work has lots of female nudity, with the fact that I use my own body a lot of the time. I still get comments of people sort of, you know, men will come up and ask me and be like, oh, is that you then? And it'll still make me a little uncomfortable sometimes. And I know it's made other people uncomfortable sometimes to look at my work, because I don't think it's particularly confrontational what I do at all, especially compared to a lot of sort of other feminist artists. But I think it can still make people uncomfortable, and including the artists themselves sometimes. And I think it is that thing of coming back to the stereotypes for a second. Sometimes I think we can be so worried about the fact that we might be conforming to certain stereotypes that you go almost out of your way to fight against it. Like, I don't want to be considered this stereotype. I'm going to fight against it and make sure. And obviously, like, that can sometimes just mean that women have to work twice as hard to be taken seriously. There might be a woman in the workplace who's trying so hard to avoid being called bossy that she becomes very passive instead of being assertive. But obviously, a lot of the time with men, it's not really a concern. And a lot of the time, it'll just be sort of classed as good leadership skills, whereas a woman might be called bossy. And it is, I mean, obviously it works. It works both ways. Like, stereotypes, they're not always harmful. Like, I'm fully aware, for example, that I probably tick most of the boxes for a stereotypical art student. Like, you can happily embrace stereotypes sometimes, but I think perpetuating certain stereotypes in the workplace can be quite harmful. I think emotional's particularly an interesting one, because it's often, I don't know if you sort of feel the same, but I think it's often applied to women quite negatively. But really, it's a difficult one, because a lot of the time it could be passionate, it could be vulnerable, empathetic, but women can be classed as emotional. But I think what's quite damaging for men in this case is that the only reason that women are typically classed as the more emotional ones is because there's so much pressure placed on men to be the strong and silent type. So it's definitely damaging both ways. You know what I mean? Like, I know there's more of a conversation nowadays around men's mental health as well, which is obviously very important. But I don't think we all realize, by casually using these stereotypes and reinforcing them in everyday life, the damage that it can actually do to everyone.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And like, there's that element as well, how I think emotional is such an interesting stereotype that women get given, and it is sometimes perceived in a negative way, but we have a maternal instinct that men don't have. So evolution says that we are designed to be more emotional, because we carry that maternal instinct that men don't necessarily have, in the same way that they say men have developed or evolved to have stronger physiques, because historically they are the ones that had to go out and get the food while the woman stayed home. And if you're taking back that far, that is where it comes from. So it's a positive thing, and it's a strength that we have. And I like that you mentioned that we can use that to sort of now address men's mental health as well, and use that to help men be more in touch with their mental health, those who are struggling. That's something that's becoming more, like, bringing more and more awareness at the moment. And so I think it can be really perceived in a much more positive way. I definitely agree.
I think the kind of real gain for people working in the creative arts is that there isn't necessarily a workplace per se. You know, the place of work is the work that we put out there as creatives. Sorry, the dog's going to bark then. in that way, you know, we are judged on the individual characteristics or properties or qualities in our work, you know, our artwork, whether or not, you know, we're photographers or printmakers or painters or illustrators. It's about how we create, how we respond to problems, the ideas that we want to explore through our work, the concepts we want to give voice through our kind of imagery. And I think that that's kind of a slightly different thing than if you go to an office where there are other people working. I think how our work is judged is on an individual basis. And I think to a certain extent, there is a degree of like non-gender kind of I don't know what the word would be, agenda in that kind of process. I think people are looking at people's work in an intuitive way. They're looking at it based on their own visual aesthetic interest, based on their own experiences. And, in a way, the creator isn't the person that's being judged in that way. It's the artwork itself and the messages and the quality in that artwork. And I think that's classically the kind of case in the illustration industry that I'm kind of known in, where, I don't think I know who the kind of most successful women are or the most successful men are. I just know the kind of people who are working in the industry and the imagery that's successful at any one time and how they're being used. And really that, I think the whole gender thing doesn't even come into that equation. It's literally to do with their response and their contribution to culture at the moment. And I think that they're commissioned based on their work. On that basis, it's kind of a face-to-face thing, isn't part of the equation. It's not based on the personality or the gender of the creator. It's based on the kind of the work as an entity in its own right, really, with its own properties and its own kind of life. So I think that's kind of the liberating aspect of the creative identities, really. I think, and that's certainly in the kind of last 10 years that I've kind of recognised, I think that's really there has been a shift. I think that because we don't need to be represented by agents anymore. We can put our work out there. We can get our own followers. We can kind of create our own businesses. We can distribute what we do in many more kind of ways. I think we are much more empowered, and I think our work is much more kind of judged for what it is as a result of that. It reaches more people, and people are able to find it. We're able to find our tribes as well through the kind of accessibility of new kind of social media outlets in particular.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that kind of contravenes the whole kind of, gallery approach, really, doesn't it? We don't have to rely on directors. I mean, having said that, there are many more female directors in galleries over the last 10 years than there ever were. There is a shift in the institutions of art, definitely. But then I think, we are all now making our own kind of way forward, aren't we? Our own avenues, and turning some of those institutions on their head much more. So I think that is kind of much more equality, which has kind of come from the roots up, really, rather than kind of more of that hierarchical kind of starter in the art kind of business.
Okay, we've had to jump out and come back in because I don't pay for Zoom. So as Jo was saying, I think the main goal here, isn't it, is that we reach a point of gender equality, and we reach a point of not necessarily needing to have these conversations anymore, where we talk about issues that still exist. And now, especially with the progression of awareness of transgender and gender identification in as an entire concept, we hope to reach a point where there's no discrimination in that sense. But it is International Women's Day, and I think we wouldn't have got to this point without the suffragettes and the conversations that we're having now, as big and small as that is. So we can still celebrate that. And I wanted to ask you both to sort of round off this episode. Who is your biggest female inspiration? So it can be someone in your field of work. It can be a colleague. It can be a friend, family member. Who would you say that is? Jo, if we could start with you.
Well, actually, so my biggest kind of source of inspiration was my mum in life, and she didn't have a career. She didn't have any kind of recognition externally as a champion of industry or anything like that, but she was fiercely independent and assured in her own personality. And I think in my family, my dad was quite a kind of dominant and strong man, and he kind of did the typical male thing of kept his family and went to work. My mum stayed at home, kind of thing. But actually she was so strong and powerful, and I didn't realize that when I was a child growing up. I didn't have any kind of sense of how to measure that. But retrospectively, kind of looking back, I realised that she really instilled in me and my sisters as well, just a real sense that be sure of who you are and kind of work at being the best version of who you are, and then put that out in society, really. And I think that was kind of the biggest thing, when I've admired people in my career, I've had tutors that have been really brilliant. I've had people who are, in industry really kind of exciting that I've looked up to, and colleagues as well who I've kind of really, empathized with and thought I want to kind of aspire to that kind of level of excellence. And I'm still surrounded by people like that who I find, I'm learning from. That's a dog squeaking his toy there, by the way. In the background, that's the kind of joy of Zoom, isn't it? You've got a dog as well. But I think, it's sometimes the kind of the people who are, I suppose not necessarily accomplished, but who have got a kind of clarity about their own identity. I think that's something to sort of bear in mind, really. It's not just about kind of success measured in terms of institutional kind of criteria. It's not necessarily how high you rise in an institution or in a company. It's really the kind of place that you find for yourself in society, and how you position yourself and how happy you make yourself in your life. I think that's what I've learned from her, really, to have like your own goals and your own ambitions, and not to really kind of be driven by socially constructed ambitions and goals, because that's another danger, isn't it, that people might think as a woman, I've got to kind of rise to be a managing director, I've got to show people that I can be a professor, I've got to get my work in the Tate Gallery. And like, well, who dictates that to us? Where have they come from? Where have those kind of society norms come from? It's much better to find your own kind of sense of what your own kind of goals are going to be, and kind of work towards those, and don't let things get in the way, really, to kind of find ways of kind of reaching your own potential, whatever that might be. And I think that's what my mum showed me and my sisters, really. It's about kind of forming your own identity, your own sense of worth, and really kind of working with that. And I think that's given me the power to be successful in my career, really. And it's not been about ambition and being measured by other people. It's been about realising my own goals and objectives. And I think that's the best kind of gift that she gave me, and maybe that I can pass on as a tutor to other people, really. Identify who you are, and then kind of, if you've got a solid belief in yourself, then people won't bash that and dent it. You can exist in a kind of male dominated environment because you feel confident with who you are, full stop. So it's about measuring yourself against what you think is important rather than other people feeling it's important.
Definitely. And that sort of inner confidence, as opposed to how you're being viewed by other people sort of externally, is a great way to carry yourself. And Alice, what about you? Who are your female inspirations or inspiration?
I struggled to narrow it down, I've got to say. There's a lot of women that have inspired me. I'm very fortunate. I've got a lot of strong women in my life who really inspire me. I know Jo said, obviously, my mum has been a huge inspiration to me, my nan, my friends. In terms of, I think for me, female musicians is quite an interesting one, particularly queer female musicians I find very inspiring. Somebody that my mum played me when I was a little kid. I grew up listening to Annie DeFranco. I've always found her to be a massive, massive inspiration. She's a very talented musician, great lyricist. She started writing from a very young age and inspired me to do the same. But also just sort of, again, going off what Jo was saying, she's so unashamedly herself and sort of continues to still unashamedly be herself as an older woman as well. And I think it's very inspiring to be outspoken and to always be ambitious and confident and comfortable in who you are, because I know that's something that a lot of women struggle with. And so seeing female role models who are so out there and so talented at what they do. I mean, there's a load more that I could list sort of very briefly. Recently, I've been massively inspired by the likes of Stella Donnelly and Ollie Parks. But there's so many female musicians at the minute who can often be quite underrepresented, but they're massive inspirations to me.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I can only echo what you've both said. My mum, my sisters, my best friends, they're all, seeing them succeed in what it is they love doing makes me want to succeed in whatever it is that I love doing. So that's definitely an inspiration for me. So thank you both for coming on and chatting to me today. This is so nice when you're working from home and you see the same people every day. I've loved talking to different people. So thank you for that. That wraps things up for today. A few words from us here at the Arts Council. We are still working from home throughout lockdown, so any questions you have for us regarding funding deadlines or other creative queries, we are still here for you. Equally, if you want to get the word out about a creative project, business, or anything similar that you are working on, please let us know and we can include you in our weekly newsletter. You can also head online and create yourself an account to be included in our artist directory. That's on our website at iomarts.com. To get in touch, find us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter by searching Isle of Man Arts Council or email us at iomartscouncil@gov.in. Thank you once again to my guests and to all our listeners out there. Please stay safe and see you next episode.